Skeleton Under the Tree. Can you think of driving past what you think is a top-tier Halloween decoration, a full-on skeleton hanging from a tree right next to a busy intersection in Spring Hill, Tennessee? If yes, you're maybe thinking, well, that's a solid commitment to the spooky season, but hold on. In this story from 2014, reality turned out to be far darker than any ghost story. This wasn't just any skeleton. In fact, it was a real body that had been hanging there for weeks, and people were busy admiring the decoration without realizing the chilling truth. Now, think about this. The tree was located near a major intersection, meaning hundreds, maybe even thousands of people drove by, snapping photos, pointing at the decoration, and all the while, a real person was basically decomposing right in front of them. That's the horrifying twist. This wasn't just a body that went unnoticed, it became part of the landscape. By the time someone finally called the cops, the body was so far decomposed that it was almost impossible to identify the person. It was eventually ruled a suicide, but you can imagine the eerie feeling that must have swept over the town. For weeks, people had been interacting with death without even realizing it. If that doesn't send shivers down your spine, what will? It's the ultimate proof that sometimes the line between decoration and death is thinner than we think, and every Halloween in that town, people probably can't help but glance twice at every skeleton they see. Murder of Martha Moxley. When 15-year-old Martha Moxley's body was found under a tree in her own backyard on Halloween night in 1975, the town of Greenwich, Connecticut was shaken to its core. But this wasn't just a typical murder, it was a real-life horror story filled with twists straight out of a crime novel. Martha was brutally beaten with a golf club, and what should have been an open and shut case turned into a decades-long mystery. Why? Because the main suspects were the Skelton family, wealthy neighbors of the Moxleys and cousins to the Kennedys. Yeah, those Kennedys. The golf club that killed her, it came from the Skelton house, but the investigation, it stalled for years. Money, influence, and connections seemed to cloud everything. For decades, the case lingered unsolved until 2002 when Michael Skelton, one of the brothers, was finally convicted of Martha's murder, but even then, the story wasn't over. In 2013, Michael was granted a new trial, released on bail, and is still free today. The Skelton family's wealth and power cast a long shadow over this case, turning what should have been a search for justice into a twisted tale of privilege and delay. To this day, the murder of Martha Moxley remains one of the most controversial cases in American history. It's not just a story of murder, it's a reminder of how money can influence even the most tragic situations, making justice a difficult thing to pin down. Trick-or-treat nightmare. Halloween is supposed to be a night of harmless fun. Costumes, candy, maybe the occasional haunted house. But for Leslie Mazzata and Adrienne Insomnia, Halloween 2004 in Napa, California ended in a real-life nightmare. The two women had spent the evening handing out candy to trick-or-treaters, blissfully unaware that the real horror was lurking closer to home. At around 2 a.m., their third roommate, Lauren, heard noises upstairs. At first, she thought her friends were just moving around, but the sounds soon turned into something far more terrifying. The unmistakable noises of a violent struggle. Frozen with fear, Lauren fled to the backyard, hiding until she felt it was safe to return. When she did, she found her friends brutally murdered. This wasn't some random break-in gone wrong. The killer was Eric Koppel, a man who had attended their housewarming party months earlier. His motive? An insane cocktail of jealousy and rage. Koppel, dating one of Adrienne's friends, had been stewing in resentment, and on that fateful night, he finally snapped, taking his rage out on two innocent women. The senselessness of the crime sent shockwaves through Napa. Koppel had blended in so well with the community that no one suspected him for nearly a year. The revelation that a seemingly normal acquaintance could harbor such violent tendencies was terrifying, leaving behind a Halloween memory that still haunts the town. Mystery of Ashley Hall. In 2015, a quiet town in North Carolina found itself wrapped in a real-life horror that no one could have predicted. 17-year-old Ashley Hall was dressed as a vampire that night, her costume complete with pale makeup, dark eyeliner, and fangs, ready for a night of trick-or-treating with friends. But as the festive night drew to a close, Ashley never made it home. Hours turned into a tense, sleepless night for her family, who initially thought she might have stayed out late. Yet, when morning came, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Ashley had vanished. What makes this case even more bone-chilling is not just the circumstances of her disappearance, but the eerie detail of her costume. It was as if Ashley had unknowingly dressed for her own death, embodying a creature of the night only to fall victim to a real-life monster. The idea of someone so young dressed up and enjoying Halloween meeting such a violent and terrifying end feels like something straight out of a horror movie, yet this was no fiction. Days after her disappearance, Ashley's body was discovered miles from her home, discarded like a piece of trash in a remote rural area. She had been strangled to death. Her vampire costume, once playful, now added an extra layer of horror to the crime. It was as if her lifeless body had been staged as part of a sick and twisted Halloween display. Despite the horror and heartbreak, the investigation hit roadblocks almost immediately. Extensive searches were conducted and people in the community were questioned. Police scoured the area for clues and tips from the public poured in, but nothing led them closer to identifying her killer. The town, once a peaceful and tight-knit community, was left on edge. Parents who had once let their children roam freely on Halloween now kept them indoors, terrified that a predator was still out there. The idea that someone could snatch a teenage girl right off the streets in the middle of a festive night filled with laughter and costumes sent shockwaves through the town. Who was behind this heinous crime? Was it someone Ashley knew, or a complete stranger lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? To make matters worse, Halloween, a time that once brought joy, was forever tainted. How could anyone enjoy dressing up and going out when the unsolved mystery of Ashley Hall's murder still haunted their streets? The killer had evaded justice, and for the people of North Carolina, the uncertainty was almost as unbearable as the crime itself. The unanswered question of who killed Ashley Hall and why hangs in the air to this day. It's not just about finding a criminal, it's about understanding the twisted mind that could commit such a brutal act on a night when everyone was supposed to be safe. The tragedy remains a chilling reminder that even on a night dedicated to playful scares and innocent fun, true evil can lurk in the shadows, waiting to strike when you least expect it. Sister Cathy Cesnik. Sister Cathy Cesnik was more than just a nun. She was a beloved school teacher, an advocate for her students, and someone determined to uncover the truth about abuse happening within the walls of Archbishop Keough High School. But in 1969, just days after Halloween, Sister Cathy vanished. Her body was found months later in January 1970, but the story of her death is far from solved. Sister Cathy had reportedly been investigating a horrific ring of abusive priests at the school where she taught. Former students later came forward claiming she was preparing to expose the truth when she mysteriously disappeared. Was her murder a convenient way to silence her? Many believe it was, and the shocking part, there's evidence to suggest that church officials, people who should have been protecting their community, might have played a role in covering up her death. The story has been subject of documentaries, books, and countless debates, but to this day, no one knows exactly who killed Sister Cathy and why. What's undeniable, though, is that her death opened the floodgates for other victims to come forward. Sister Cathy's murder may have been an attempt to bury the truth, but in the end, it exposed the dark underbelly of an institution meant to be trusted. Halloween might be about ghouls and ghosts, but in Sister Cathy's case, the real monsters were the ones wearing collars. Key West Haunted Doll. Have you ever felt like your toys were watching you? Well, in the case of Robert the Doll, it wasn't just a feeling, it was a living nightmare. In the early 1900s, a young boy named Robert Eugene Otto received a life-size doll as a gift from a servant. The doll, dressed in a sailor suit, became his constant companion. But there was something off. Neighbors claimed they saw the doll moving from window to window when the family wasn't home, and the Otto family reported hearing eerie giggles and footsteps coming from Robert's room. Now, here's where things get really creepy. Young Robert started blaming the doll for mischief around the house. Broken objects, overturned furniture, and strange happenings were all pinned on the doll. Most parents would just shrug it off as childhood imagination, but not the Ottos. They started hearing the doll speak, and not in that cute toy way either, but in that deep, menacing voice. What's worse, it's said that the doll had a knack for turning its head to watch people as they walked by. So, what's the deal with Robert the Doll? What does he actually do? Back in the late 1940s, some of the first stories about Robert the Doll doing things your average doll wouldn't started popping up. Kids in Key West claimed they saw Robert moving around in the window of the Otto family home at 534 Eaton Street. Over the years, folks have noticed Robert moving around by himself, laughing, and even tossing things around the room. Guests on the ghost hunt at Fort East Martello have reported seeing Robert's chest move like he's breathing and feeling a mysterious presence touching their knee. Sometimes cold chills and orbs drift around Robert's room. Robert the doll now resides in a museum in Key West, Florida, where visitors have reported experiencing terrifying misfortunes after interacting with him. They claim you must ask Robert's permission before taking a picture. If you don't, brace yourself for some paranormal payback. Halloween Party Massacre. Imagine being at a Halloween party, surrounded by laughter, music, and friends in costumes, only for the night to end in sheer terror. In 2016, that nightmare became reality in San Antonio, Texas, when a man dressed as Freddy Krueger showed up uninvited to a Halloween house party. But this wasn't just some guy trying to crash the fun, he was there for blood. Freddy Krueger, the infamous dream killer from A Nightmare on Elm Street, became all too real when the man pulled out a gun and opened fire on the guests. The party, which had been filled with dancing and fun, quickly descended into chaos and people ran for their lives. In total, 5 people were injured, and the shooter, he slipped away into the night, leaving behind nothing but fear and confusion. It's a story that feels ripped from a horror movie, but is a reminder that sometimes real life can be scarier than fiction. Every year since, people in San Antonio think twice before inviting Freddy Krueger to their parties. Christopher Jenkins. Christopher Jenkins was a college student in Minneapolis, Minnesota, out celebrating Halloween in 2002 when he mysteriously disappeared. Wearing a Native American costume, he was last seen leaving a bar after a night of Halloween fun. 4 months later, his body was found in the Mississippi River, still dressed in his Halloween costume. At first, authorities ruled Christopher's death an accident, suggesting that he had fallen into the river after a night of drinking, but his family wasn't convinced. They pushed for further investigation, and in 2006, the case took a shocking turn. The police reclassified Christopher's death as a homicide, though the exact circumstances remain unknown. There's an eerie and unsettling feeling that comes with the image of Christopher still in his costume floating in the river. Was he a victim of foul play, a tragic accident, or something even more sinister? His case leaves more questions than answers, and every Halloween, the people of Minneapolis can't help but wonder what really happened that night. Voice in the Desert. Josh and Dan, 2 friends in their 20s, thought a camping trip in the remote desert of New Mexico would be the perfect getaway. The vast, star-filled sky stretched out above them as they drifted to sleep after a long day of hiking, the night peaceful and quiet. But in the dead of night, Josh was jolted awake by the sound of Dan's voice calling from the darkness, frantic, "Come here, quick, look!" Half asleep and confused, Josh got up and began walking toward the voice. The words repeated, exactly the same, unnatural like a broken record. Just as Josh took another step, a hand grabbed him from behind. It was Dan, standing right there with a terrified look on his face, pressing his finger to his lips. If Dan was with him, who or what was out there calling? The voice continued, growing louder, more demanding, but Josh and Dan didn't wait to find out what it was. They quickly packed their things and fled, the sense of being watched heavy in the air. Whatever was mimicking Dan's voice that night, it wasn't human, and it's something they'll never forget.